So my name is Megan. I live in Denver, Colorado. I'm a consultant. I'm a solution consultant with a company called Blue Granite. I'm a data platform MVP, which just means Microsoft has recognized me for contributions to the community. I like to blog and speak at events like this, and I'm a bulldog owner, just as a side note. If you follow me on Twitter, it's probably 75% tech stuff and 25% dogs, so you've been warned. But I promise my dog is really cute, and you'll see him later in this presentation. So I'd like to start with a question. Let's say you're interviewing candidates for a business analyst position, and this guy walks in. What's your first impression? Anybody? Exciting interview. That's an interesting response. I like that. Bow ties are cool. This actually fits really well. Keep it going. You're definitely going to remember him. You're definitely not going to hire him, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So his outfit might be distracting from his message. He might be really, really competent as a business analyst, the best business analyst you've ever met, but the way that it got packaged, the way he dressed himself today, might not have conveyed that message very well. Maybe that means you shouldn't hire him. Who knows? Maybe you think it's really interesting and you'd like to take a chance. But what you're not thinking about while you're thinking about his clown hair and nose are his qualifications. The message that he wants to send you of hire him doesn't exist because the packaging we've put around it, his visuals say don't hire me for most of us. So what I'm hoping we'll do today is kind of a what not to wear data viz edition. Anybody remember that show? It's been off the air for a couple years. So what happens in the show, for those of you who didn't religiously watch it, is someone's friends and family would nominate them because they had some wardrobe problems. And they would get, if they gave up all their wardrobe, they would get a $5,000 gift card or something like that to go shopping. And they would get lots of tips to try to make their wardrobe better. But in the end, it usually wasn't really just, oh, I have poor taste in color. There was some deep-seated issue about themselves. They weren't communicating who they were, but they were worried that if they got this new wardrobe, they wouldn't look a certain way. They wouldn't look cool, or they wouldn't convey their personality. So I think a lot of people come in trying to make really cool data viz and get a little bit lost in what they were really trying to say to people. So that's my goal for this session today. But I want to start out with a little bit of clarification. There are really two types of analysis that we can use data visualizations to help us with. There's the exploratory. That's when we don't know what's in our data. We're just kind of throwing things on a page, maybe running some R scripts, Python, your code of choice, to figure out what's going on. And it's usually for our own personal use as we just try to go through the motions of understanding what we've got. And then there's explanatory. And explanatory is what we do once we've figured out kind of what we would like to show. Even though our data may be refreshing, we're now communicating to someone else. I'm sharing my Power BI report with you so that you can also now understand this data. What I'm talking about when I talk about data viz makeovers is the explanatory side. When you are doing exploratory, yes, there are absolutely some charts that work better or some techniques, but it's mostly for you. And so I'm going to focus on the how do I communicate data to other people. But here's the problem. Data visualization is communication. We miscommunicate all the time. We talk in different languages, we use different lingo. It happens, and it continues to happen in data viz, maybe even more so than in just normal conversation. So if you accept that fact, then you can think about data viz when we're doing explanatory data viz. You wouldn't walk up to do a press conference and just wing it. Hey guys, I'm here to talk about data viz. I don't really know, we're gonna say some stuff. You would never do that in a press conference. You would choose your wording carefully. We want your explanatory data viz to kind of also have that thought put into it. You can start your exploratory by just slapping things on the page, but in the end, your explanatory should be a little more polished to make sure you're conveying what you want to convey. Here's the other problem. Data viz is a skill that we don't learn early in our lives. We don't learn it when we learn math in school. It's getting better in higher education, but it's not really a thing that we are taught, but a whole lot of us do it. Most jobs have some kind of data viz component. We put some chart together at least every once in a while. If you are a consultant or an analyst or a developer who has to make a lot of data viz, you also have the struggle of not only are you still learning, but your end users and your stakeholders are still learning. So sometimes they ask you for things that don't go with best practices, or they can't imagine what best practices look like because that's not available in your organization. So we have both us and our audience that doesn't always know what good data viz looks like. But it's a whole lot easier to recognize bad data viz as opposed to say, this is really good. Bad data viz elicits reactions. And a lot of times, if it's just in your company, there's a lot of boredom. We just click on something and go to a report and go, yeah, it's that report. But a lot of times it can be worse. It can be confusion, or if it's really bad, there are some reports, and especially if you've gotten into data viz, you're kind of disgusted by it. And hopefully by the end of the day, you'll understand why you have that reaction, or why I have that reaction, and understand that the reaction we want is interest. We want them, our users, to be positively engaged. We want people clicking in our report. We want them to not think of it and go, oh God, I gotta go get in that report again. So this is my dog, Buster. Like I said, he's adorable. He's super interested in what I was doing because I had a treat in my hand. There is a part of data viz that is just explaining information, but there is also a part of data viz that is about user engagement. When we talk to people about effectiveness of user interfaces in general, how they feel about it is they can't distinguish that from how efficient and effective it really was. They're all kind of melded together. So I would like to introduce you to the fail pug. This is the fail pug. He looks very, very sad. He's sad because your data viz is bad. And I would like to posit that there are 3 main reasons why our data viz is bad. And the first is our definition of success in data viz is wrong. We've been set up to think that when we make super shiny reports, or that when we show off what we can do as data visualization developers, that is success. And I would like to disagree with that. And we'll get into more detail in a second. My second reason why we fail at data viz is that we don't structure and order our information purposefully. We don't think about how people get into that analysis of the information we're trying to present. Things don't flow. And my last common reason why we fail, and this is where most people start with, is that we fail to consider how humans interpret visual design. So this is your kind of graphic arts techniques, your cognitive psychology stuff of, do I really want to use bright colors everywhere? Well, there are reasons in the way that we take in information visually that tell us, no, I don't want everything on my page to be a super bright color. So if those are why we fail, I'm going to help define success in data viz. And I'm going to define data visualization as any effort to help people understand the significance of their data by placing it in a visual context. So if I used some kind of visual to tell people what the data says and what it means to them, that's data visualization. I don't care what tool you're using. I don't care if it's an infographic or a printed report. It's all data viz. So success really means not just understanding the data. I can see that my sales were 1.5 million last year, but understanding its significance. My sales were 1.5 million last year. That's above goal, and it was year over year 10% higher. So we ultimately want to get to, what does my audience need to know? And what's the most efficient and effective way to tell them that? If we were really mature in our data viz, all of our visuals would help our audience make a decision or take an action. there's a great blogger slash author slash now podcast person named Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. She's storytelling with data. And she actually says that people should take a stance and make sure that every visual entices your audience or requires your audience to make a decision. That's really hard for data people because we feel like we don't own that data. So we want to make sure, even if we need some help getting there, that everything leads towards this purpose. Because if you're not using my data to make a decision or take an action, why are you looking at my report? We fall into this trap of, oh, I have a report for that, I'm good. Well, what does it tell you and how did you use it? That's our ultimate question. So we can't always jump right to, yep, I can help this person make a decision. I can't jump immediately into prescriptive analytics to tell me exactly what to do, but I'm gonna keep that kind of as my focus point to get there eventually. So if that's my definition of success, my goal is not to show how many different chart types I can use. Anybody recognize this? This is actually a Power BI custom visual, and people really like it, but it also got really overused for the novelty factor, and people started putting it in real reports. It's not inherently bad necessarily. It depends on your situation and your purpose, but a lot of people put it in to go, hey, look what I did. So here's a real life example, and different people have different opinions, but I'm gonna say that if my audience is the general public, this chart was kind of hard to read. If you look up there, there's a great description on the right, but it's gonna take you a long time to interpret what this person was saying. So he's talking about the peak time for when people play sports. Each activity, each color of line is a different activity. So purple is bowling, and the length of the line to the left of the circle is how much time they spent before noon. The right is how much time they spent between noon and midnight. The angle is the activity's popularity between 2003 and 2015. Now, I will fully admit that looks kind of cool, but it's gonna take me 10 minutes to figure out what I was trying to say. So this may not be an effective visualization in a business setting where people need information quickly. So I may turn this into a bunch of boring bar charts, but you know what? You're gonna read it a lot quicker. And I may find ways to make it interesting, engaging for people, but I'm going to make sure I'm not going for novelty over clarity first. The second thing that is not your goal in DataViz is to show off how many reporting features you can use. We've got Power BI is stacked full of great reporting features. We've got bookmarks, we've got drill throughs, we've got interactivity that we can change, and they're all great, but they can be overused or misused. So this is an actual report from another vendor that I found online, and you can watch it for a second. It's just an animated GIF. There's a lot going on here. What I don't immediately get out of here is a bunch of good information. What I notice is those ruler gauges, they bounce when stuff changes. The donut chart keeps re-rendering itself. They added some cool features in here, but it really feels like features for the sake of features. Even the nice map on the left, depending on which doctor I click on, their name is cut off. So they weren't going for communication here, they were going for cool factor. And your final thing that is not your goal is to make shiny things. Shiny things are shiny, they're pretty, but they aren't always effective. So here's an infographic that is a comment bubble that is 3D, so it's like a stepped 3D pie chart, which is kind of awful. And what you're gonna look at is all the design around it and not the information. Because the way that I get information out of this is to look at the 3 numbers that are labeled on top of it. I don't actually get information out of the chart. So if you're doing this in a business setting, an organizational setting, we want to balance that. Shiny is not inherently bad, but shiny that makes it harder for me to understand what you're trying to say, that is bad. And finally, this is the one I think most of the analyst, BI developer crowd falls into a lot, is displaying all the data. Well, I did all this work to make a data warehouse. I put it all together, and I want to show that I have all this data. I need to show all the fields, or I need to show at least all the dimensions that people can slice by. I want to make sure all the options are there just in case, or just to show that it's available. Well, it doesn't work very well because people will miss stuff. There's a concept called, we'll talk about it later, cognitive load. And if there's too much stuff on the page, people are going to back off and just leave. They're not even going to look at your report. So our goal is not to display all of the data. Our goal is to display the right data. So I call this one no data point left behind because there's a lot going on there. This is from PayScale, and you can grab the link from the slides that are available to you. They're talking about how top tech employers rank over several different categories. So early career median pay, median age, years experience, percent female. These are all good things. But take a look at that and tell me how long it would take to analyze one company. So how's Microsoft doing? Yeah, it feels like a weird, crazy connect the dots thing going on. And it's not necessarily that you can't do multivariate analysis, but think about your audience and what you're trying to say. So instead of thinking of a message first and then making a visualization to fit that, they went, let me make a really cool thing to show off all the data that I have. So let's talk about purposeful and structure. I'm going to see a few people roll their eyes when I use this term, but I'm kind of talking about storytelling. And the reason a lot of us roll our eyes when we talk about storytelling is because our data is dynamic. We make reports that automatically refresh. So when people like storytelling with data come up and do an example, they get static data that they dump down into like Excel or something. They know exactly what their story is. When I get called into a client, I'm making something that refreshes, and so what the data looks like today is not what it looks like tomorrow. So storytelling takes on a little bit of a different strategy for me since I don't know my data points. So I hope by the end of this you can be less prone to eye rolling when we talk about storytelling. When I do storytelling, I first want to know who my intended audience is. And sometimes a report has multiple audience groups. So I make a report, and it may be used by analysts and executives. And they may care about different things. But the first thing I want to know is what's important to them. When it's a sales report and it's for salespeople, what are they comped on? What do they get measured on? What does your boss ask you? How is what going? What do you get measured on? That's what's important to them. So I figure out for each distinct group within the audience of my report, which this means you have to know who your audience is before you build it, what do they want? What do they care about? And then for each of those groups, I figure out what are their first 3 questions. So when they jump into my report, what are the first 3 things they want to know? So let's take an example. I'm a consultant, and so I'm worried about utilization. For those not in the consulting world, this is some concept of how many hours of my week do I spend on client stuff versus administrative stuff or things that don't lead to more company value, really. So my first 3 questions for a report about utilization would be, how am I doing against my goal? Most of consultants have some goal they're trying to hit. I must be 80% utilized. That's not my number. I'm just making up something. Does my forecast, so whatever I'm going to work on for the next month or so, keep me above goal? I may be okay now, but am I going to be okay in a month? And then where's my time going? So if there is an issue, or even if there isn't, am I splitting my time in a way that I find to be effective and enjoyable? So those are my first 3 questions. So let's look at an example dashboard. This is not really the one I use, there's something wrong with this. So we've got, in the top left, utilization. We've got an hours distribution that says that I spend 10% of my time in sales, 60% on client projects, 10% on marketing, and 20% on admin. And then I've got projected utilization and utilization year to date, my billable hours, both actual and forecast, and my weekly forecast for the next 8 weeks. What's wrong here? Anybody? Somebody said they don't get it. Yeah, it's not addressing my 3 questions. I'm burying the lead. So I may have explained the data that's there, but I didn't explain its significance to the intended user, this time me, at all. I don't know how am I doing. There's nothing in here that says, yeah, you're good, or no, you're way under. There's nothing in here, even though I have forecast in here, it doesn't tell me, am I forecasted so that I'll be okay, where I'm above my goal. It kind of tells me how I distribute my time, where I spend my time, but that's my 3rd question, and it's in the first spot that I look. So my order of things is wrong. So I'm going to tell you some things about my mom. My mom is a lovely lady. She's one of the kindest people I know, and she gave me permission to say this. She's a horrible storyteller. She lives in Texas, and we talk on the phone a lot. That's how I keep in touch, and then I go home a few times a year. But she gets stuck on really unimportant details, and I find it really endearing. It's one of the things that I love about my mom, and we kind of joke about it. She'll tell me a story about my cousin, and she can't remember which little town outside of Fort Worth my cousin just moved to, and so the whole story is dead. She is notorious for saying, I ran into your friend from high school's mother. Now, she can't tell me which friend it is, and that was like the important part of the story. So she'll start lots of stories, and then 2 weeks later, call me back and finish the story when she finally remembers it, or when something triggers, or I finally figure out what she was talking about. So my mom is amazing and great, but you don't want your data viz to be like my mom's stories. So when I say storytelling, I don't mean, and this is where people get a little eye-rolly, filtering and massaging the data to make it more interesting. That's not really our goal. Now, we want it to be relevant, but relevant and trying to make it more interesting by changing the data or leaving pieces out are 2 different things. What I also don't mean is showing visuals one at a time. So there are certain reporting features of other tools where you can kind of click along, and you can do this in Power BI too, and you have to consume things one visual at a time as you change some kind of filter. And that may be appropriate in some situations, but if people need to see multiple data points together and you're only feeding them one thing at a time, you're actually impeding their getting the information that they want out of your data viz. So what I do mean is purposeful structure and order on the page. Am I answering the right questions in the right order? And am I providing navigation paths that make it really obvious how to get there? So here's a possible option for how to order your information on a dashboard. This isn't the only way, but it's kind of my default to start with, and then I can change it up from there as I need to. So I take my 3 questions that I think each audience may want, and I answer that question first. What's the most important thing people want to know? That goes in my top left area. People tend to read in Western cultures in a Z. Some people say it's kind of like a backwards F, so that top left gets the most views, and then we kind of scan to the right and then back down to the left and over. So if you want to hide something in your data viz, it goes in the bottom right. If you put something unimportant in the top left, you wasted a lot of really expensive real estate on your screen. So I cringe a little bit when people put giant logos of their own company on an internal-only report in the top left, and it's the brightest thing on the page, because they wasted that screen real estate, and that's the part where we have people's attention most. The first thing I ask them is, do you know where you work? If so, and this report isn't leaving the internal office, If you need a logo to distinguish your report for clients, that's a totally different beast. You probably don't even need the logo at all. There could be reasons why people include it. That's their way of saying this report has been approved and making sure people know that it came from a reputable source. But still, I probably don't put that in the top left. That's my prime real estate. So when you're ordering this stuff, you really have to empathize with your users. I know we're all logical in here, but data viz does require empathy. Data viz is a lot like user experience work. And the way I think about it is that everybody's busy. Most people are not here to look at my beautiful reports. What they really want to do is go home a little earlier or get more stuff done while they're at work. So my job is not to make the most beautiful thing you've ever seen with the coolest, shiniest viz. My job is to get you home, give you what you need so you can go on your way. But I also want you to have a good experience while you're doing it. So there's a challenge in that. People go, oh, we want to delight our audience. How do I keep my users engaged? And there's a balance in that. You may spend, what if you could have people be 1% more engaged if you spend an extra 100 hours on the report? Is it worth it? I would probably say no, depending on what it is. But it depends on the situation. If I'm making a report for thousands of people and that 1% is significant, then maybe it is. But at some point, you're getting a little bit of diminishing returns and you have to cost benefit your time on this versus how often it's used and how many people use it. Sometimes you can't delight. Sometimes, especially if you're trying to put new data viz out there, maybe you're in an organization that loves their tables and you can pry it from their cold, dead hands, they may not delight the first time you put a summarized dashboard in front of them, but they may acknowledge that you've been really efficient and it delivers the information they need faster than their manual way of looking up information in a table. And sometimes that is good enough. That is a great starting place, at least. One of the things that I think is helpful in the last 3 to 5 years is WYSIWYG editors. Most tools out there for self-service are a drag and drop thing. Whereas before, especially, I spent hours on some reporting services reports, building them out. And they were great, but if you spend 15 hours on a visual, it's your baby. You don't want to give it up. And so occasionally I just do data viz makeover gigs at work, little 1 to 2 week things where we talk about, somebody shows me what they've made and they know there's something wrong, but they can't pinpoint it. And I go, what if you tried a different chart there? And they're like, no, you cannot change this chart. You do not understand. I put 25 hours into it. It got reviewed by 3 different committees. I cannot let this chart go. And so one of the best trends that's come about is we use WYSIWYG editors that drag and drop. So the likelihood that you spent 25 hours on a single chart is lower, but I can also move it around and change the color really, really quickly so I don't feel so attached to my visuals. Because in the end, it's not about what I did, it's about what I'm trying to communicate. So sometimes you have to let go of your baby. And that's where Power BI comes in. It's good for that. I can slap together a great data model that puts everything together enough to give me some whiteboarding, and I can just kind of move things on the page and talk to people and go, so what if we looked at your data this way? And start to suss out what are those most important things. And I can try it and show it to them if I have willing stakeholders, and they'll go, no, I don't like that. But if you ask someone what they want in a report, a lot of times they can't tell you. So putting something together quickly and going, how about this, to get feedback is better than, what do you want? What do you want in this report? Because the answer is either I don't know or what I already have most of the time. The other big piece is that you have to have the right inputs, and I promise there's a reason why these things are on the screen. My dog Buster, he is an 8-year-old English bulldog, and English bulldogs are prone to joint problems. And a couple years ago, he tore his CCL, so it's like an ACL on a human, but it's his back left leg. And he had to have surgery. And for the first 6 years of his life, He loved peanut butter. Peanut butter was his favorite thing. But after he had his surgery, his leg got infected, and I had to give him lots of antibiotics. And the way that I gave him antibiotics was putting them in peanut butter and getting him to take them. Well, my dog, ever since his surgery 2 years ago, does not eat peanut butter. You cannot give it to him. He does not care. I could leave a jar of peanut butter on the floor and nothing would happen. But he loves pureed pumpkin. And it turns out, if you ever get a bulldog, pureed pumpkin is great for bulldog's digestive system. So he gets some pureed pumpkin every morning. So for him, the right input, because dogs are fairly food motivated, is pumpkin and not peanut butter. So you may make all the right data viz choices, but if you don't have the right data, it doesn't matter. You can't just build it and they will come because you didn't serve what they want. You also can't just get the right data and then throw some charts on the page. If you tell me about my data, but you don't tell me its significance to me, you didn't cross the goal line. You got it most of the way there, but you missed some stuff, and that gives people the feeling of, oh, I have to look at this report and then do extra work to get the information I need. A lot of times when people are clinging to tabular reports, Excel reports, or things people always want, can I download this? It's because somebody built a report, it doesn't meet their needs, so they download the detail behind it, do something else with it, and then pass it along to someone else. So if I can figure out what they were trying to do and automate that through the way that I load data, or just build a better visual that actually tells them what they want to know, then I can get all the way there. So not only what's the data saying, but what does it mean to me? Why is that important? Well, sales are up 5%, but you're still under goal. Anything like that that helps people understand the significance, not just report. I feel like we tend to fall into the trap of, well, I put things in this bar chart and it tells you sales by business unit. Yes, but can I add something to draw your attention to, is that good, bad? How does that relate to some other key metrics? We're not quite there yet if I just give you a metric. So we want the right inputs in the right order, and then we want to display them in a way that is very effective. So the 3 best design tools you have are color, shape, and layout. They draw your attention to things. They cause you to interpret data as being similar or different from other data points on the page. And you'll see, I'm going to show you the issues I see most often when I go look at client reports that need some help. That color, shape, and layout are what's behind most of these design problems. So number 1 that I see that's super easily fixable is just lack of alignment. There's a couple things going on here. If you look on the right, my chart titles are centered, and then my columns are not aligned. So this purple column starts here, and then it hangs out way over there, and back down, and then way back over here. The end over here doesn't quite align. Now that I've shown you that, you can't unsee it. You're going to be distracted by it. So if I fix it, sorry, I lost my mouse. You immediately feel, if you noticed it, if you are detail-oriented at all, you feel a little relief. You're like, oh, that's better. Now I can go look at something else in the report. So what happens is it's distracting. We're on our phones, we're talking to our family members, people are emailing us, we're trying to have conversations. If you work in an office, I work at home, but people are constantly coming in your door to ask you questions. If you went to get information out of this report, and then your mind wandered on, man, that alignment's kind of off, you can't help but notice that. And now you're not thinking about your data points, you're thinking about how I did a really bad job aligning things. So in Power BI, it gets a little tricky. Different chart types have different amounts of white space around them. So there is distribution and alignment features. Just like in PowerPoint, you can go, I select these 2-3 charts and I would like to align left or top. But you may actually have to adjust from there because it's not aligning the chart itself, it's aligning the containers with the visuals in them. And so that's a great starting point. I do that every time. But then I may make some manual adjustments. And you don't have to get it down to the pixel, everything exactly perfect, but you want to make sure that that lack of alignment isn't distracting. And sometimes just making it pixel perfect is the easiest way to get it there. So the second issue I see all the time is diagonal chart labels. When you look at this chart, what you tend to do, and some people actually physically do this, is go, now I can read this chart. So the reason this is bad is, again, because it's distracting. Those diagonal chart labels, those product C right here, those are the only things with that orientation. This little angle right here. So our eyes latch on to differences in orientation on the page. So then we start looking at down here, and what we really want people to do is kind of skim the tops of these bars first to notice the trend. But that's not where I look anymore. So I would rather switch my bar chart to a column chart because I have lots more room for longer horizontal labels. In Power BI, if you go to the properties on your bar chart, there is a property called max width. And it tells you how much of the chart can be taken up by category labels. So if your labels do not fit by default, you can change that max width up to 50. I think it starts at 25 or something. And then they will fit much better. If it doesn't fit, try another chart type. All of these mistakes you'll see are things that cause people to get distracted or they focus attention on the wrong things. So now when you look at charts with diagonal labels, you're going to look in the wrong spot. Your attention is precious to me if you are my user, my intended audience. So I don't want to make it any more difficult for you to look at my data viz and get what you need out of it. The third issue I see all the time is really bold chart titles. When you look up here, what's the first thing you see? Black bars, yep. You know what those black bars are not? Data. They're not the most important information on the page. They're just decoration. Titles can be important, but in this case, the titles weren't even really that descriptive. But because that black color is so intense, that is what we notice first. What if I flipped it and made it a white background? Now this particular report is not perfect, so I'm not saying make your data viz like this, but I'm just taking a couple things and changing them. I'm removing that black background. What do you notice first now? The big green bars. Yeah, so color is a really noticeable property. So now that I may not like that visual, but I'm at least focusing people on a chart where it's communicating data instead of just black background on a title. I am a fan of data labels, but there is such a thing as too many data labels. And people who build scatter plots are especially guilty of this because they want you to be able to know what every dot is. Usually when we use scatter charts, we're not trying to identify what every dot is. You might have one that you're kind of watching, or you might just be looking in general at a trend, a distribution, with a relationship between your X and Y axis. But now when I look at this, instead of looking at the green dots, I'm looking at the data labels. Well, what if I remove the data labels and just use hover text to tell me? So if I have one that's a particular outlier, I wanted to know what the one that's kind of over by itself here is, I can still hover and get the information. So we have to remember why we're building the chart and what our goal is. In this case, I'm trying to pick out some outliers, so I don't need every single data label. The other thing I see every time is non-strategic use of color contrast, meaning I use different colors because colors are pretty. It looked cool, or the tool did it by default and I didn't change it back. Do you get any more information out of this chart than this chart? No. Most people are shaking their heads no. What you do when you look at this chart with all the colors is you bounce around from bar to bar. You're not really comparing them, you're just kind of checking out all the colors. So you're gonna skim through them first, and then you're gonna come back and look at information. Well, I just wasted a second of your time doing that. Now imagine I made you a dashboard that does that on every single visual. So I'm gonna make you waste your time 6 times over. It wouldn't be very nice of me, nor would it be effective. So I'm not really considering you as my user and your time and what you want. Another thing I see a whole lot is chart borders. I'm going to make a pretty blanket statement and say you don't ever need dark black chart borders. There's never a situation that with a white background, you need super dark black intense chart borders because it's going to be distracting you from real information. I'm not saying never use chart borders, but a lot of times white space is sufficient. So we usually just need one characteristic to distinguish visuals from each other, or parts of visuals, or groups of visuals. So you can use borders if you need to, or white space, but you don't really need to use both. But if you're going to use borders, you definitely don't need really bold borders because they're not conveying that much information. So when you looked at this, the first thing you probably did was stare at all those borders around every single chart. When you look at it now, your eyes hopefully kind of skim down the left side and then maybe down the right. And all I did was remove the borders. So again, it's, am I distracting you from what I'm really trying to say? And of course, the classic bar charts that don't start at 0. Those charts are the same numbers. On the left, the y-axis starts at 35, and on the right, the y-axis starts at 0. When we look at bar charts, we judge the difference in lengths of the bars between each category. When we look at the one on the left, the difference between 47 and 96 looks really, really big. But when you look on the right, you realize, it's actually about half, So we want to be very careful when we do this, that when you're using something that has length as the visual attribute, that you actually use the complete length and start at 0. That's not true of every chart, but especially when you're doing something that uses length to convey information. And the last issue I have is too many charts on a page. This is really busy. Anybody look at this and just go, oh my gosh, no. So this is where people get into the let's display all of the data. And there's a lot of issues with this. There's lots of colors going on, so it's a little over-exaggerated, but maybe this is the right data displayed incorrectly because we just put too much stuff. So that's where those navigation paths come in. Do I need to show you all of it right there on the first page? Or is it some of it like I'm going to answer your top questions and then provide you more detail, more supporting information? So I'd like to ask the audience, are there any other really common mistakes that you see, things that just drive you crazy when you see them in a visual that either you help people build or that is there a report that you consume that you're like, man, I really wish people would stop doing this? What about fonts? Oh, inconsistent fonts, yeah. So anytime we change something, we interpret that as having meaning. Oh, well, they must have switched fonts to indicate something, but they didn't, and now you're stuck wondering why people were using inconsistent fonts instead of actually getting information out of your report. Anybody else?
Not handling absent periods. If you've got years and you don't have any data for 2014 and you're building a column chart.
Yeah, not handling absent data. So if you have like a column chart with years and you're missing data for an entire year, did you just skip it?
So putting two charts next to each other that are really completely uncorrelated, but they're lined up.
Putting two related charts next to each other that it looks like you should derive some information from the two of them together, but they're really not related at all. Yeah, so that goes back to our layout in the white space. If you put things too close together compared to other parts on the page, we go, oh, those must be related. And then we're like, okay, so how are they related? And now we went off into this land of trying to figure it out, and we again got distracted and wasted our time. Anybody else? Lots of people, okay. Slicer overload, yes, yes. It is so tempting. We want to make sure that they can slice by anything that is in the data, but then you take up like half the page with these slicers, and now you can make a collapsible slicer pane. But then when they expand it, it's still just like overload in and of itself, and it actually makes it less usable. I do see that quite a bit.
It turns it from here's your story to kind of a choose your own adventure.
Yeah, so he said it turns it from here's your story to choose your own adventure. So instead of being explanatory data viz, we went back to exploratory, but kind of couched it as explanatory. Yep, anybody else? Yes. Choosing inappropriate chart types, absolutely. One last one in the back. Oh yeah, two charts that should be comparable, but they have different axes, so you can't actually visually compare them. I see a lot of those too. Yeah, these are great. So if you're listening, the next time that you make data viz, these are what other people see too. So if you're the one that makes it, hey, you got friends that understand your pain, or if you're the one that consumes it, you can go, you know what, people do this all the time, and we should really fix this. So I'm going to get a little nerdy for a second, and we're going to talk data viz design concepts. But I'm not going to go super deep. But there are three concepts that I think are really important. So if you get into actually designing effective data viz, there are three things that I hope you will go and learn about. Even if you just do the cursory, like go read one article about it, if you start paying attention to them, it will change the way that you design. And the first one is cognitive load. Cognitive load is simply the concept that information requires brain power. It takes effort to take in information. Our brain power could be considered our working memory, and it's limited. They say that people remember about 3 to 5 things at one time. So if you put 18 things on the page, or if you use an ineffective chart type where somebody has to go and look up a number and hold that in their memory while they go find the other related chart that is far away, your likelihood of data viz success is pretty low. So we want to be very intentional about the information we present, which means don't accept defaults. Power BI has some decent defaults, but they're also not usually perfect. So don't accept defaults on layout, on color, on font sizes. We want it to be as easy to read our Power BI reports or our Excel reports, whatever we're using, as possible. There's also a related concept called perceived cognitive load, and that is how much effort we think it will take to interpret information. So if you make something really, really busy and you send that report, share that report with someone else, and they look at it and go, no, this is not worth my time and effort to go in and actually figure out what this report is saying, that is because they interpreted the perceived cognitive load as being too high. Andy Kirk, who is actually a Tableau guy but has a great data viz blog and book and a lot of other, he does workshops, talks about reward effort ratio. So if you read Stephen Pugh, Tufte, they do like data ink ratio. Nancy Duarte does signal to noise. Andy Kirk does reward effort, and it's probably a little bit of a higher, more nebulous concept, but I like thinking about it that way. So how much effort do I have to put in to reading this report to get out what I want. So getting out what I want and having a pleasant experience. How can I weight that really heavy and make the effort required to get there really low? That has to do with cognitive load. How much burden are you placing on your user to get what they need? The only way to reduce cognitive load is to know what they want and to put only that on the page. If you put every bit of extra information is placing more load on them. You're never going to get your cognitive load to zero. It takes effort to learn new things, new data points. But you want to avoid extraneous cognitive load. So did my bad design cause them to take extra effort to get the information they need? So our next concept is pre-attentive attributes. And we saw a bunch of these earlier. And I said people automatically notice when orientation is different with those diagonal chart labels. That's because we know line orientation is a pre-attentive attribute. And a pre-attentive attribute is just something that we notice without making conscious effort to do so. So if you look to the right, there's a red box in this color hue. And you automatically zoomed in on it without actually going, okay, here's a black box, here's a black box, here's a black box, here's a black box, here's a red box. Your brain just figured that out. That's something that we do automatically. Just like we have spacing here between these groups, or just like this line is thicker, you don't go line by line and go, oh, that one's thicker. You kind of do this really quickly within 200 milliseconds of exposure. So pre-attentive attributes, you can see a bunch of them there, really boil down to color, form, spatial positioning, and movement. So when we saw that bad data viz where the charts bounced and all that, the reason I don't like that is because of pre-attentive attributes. We notice when they bounce, but that bouncing didn't add any information or even really a positive user experience. I didn't get anything from that. So that was more effort on my part for no extra reward. Same thing with color. When we overuse color, when color is everywhere, we start looking at everything. We can't focus. So we use color to highlight important information. We use bright color to highlight important information. So I'm not saying everything has to be black and white or gray and white, but we don't want everything to be screaming at us all the time so we don't know where to look. And the last concept, which is really a whole set of concepts if you go look up Gestalt principles, good Gestalt kind of means everything is simple and symmetrical and orderly and regular, but a key takeaway is that our brains simplify things. So when you look at this picture of birds up here, you don't see each individual bird first. You see a group of birds, and then you may zoom in on certain birds and you're checking them out. You know, this one's further up flying. Your instinct is to see a whole instead of just parts. We do that in data viz as well. So when we look at something, we like it to be simple, easy to interpret, and balanced, symmetrical. So that instinct we have to make something really cool and novel goes against Gestalt principles, because we actually, when we get information, we like it to be simple and orderly. I'm not saying don't ever try some new data viz, but think about your users and what their tolerance or appetite is to actually have new ways to interpret information. If it takes a lot of effort for them to learn it, maybe it's not the right thing right now. But sometimes we have really complex data, so that doesn't mean you should simplify away aspects of the data. Just remember that this is kind of how our brains work. We like to simplify, and we don't like when we have a lot of perceived cognitive load. So I have a list. Your data viz needs a makeover if. And I'll show you my list grouped first by those three categories. So cognitive load, my dog is really cute. No, my charts are off message. So if I had an intended purpose of the report, but my chart is off saying something else, only tangentially related, I'm violating my goal of keeping low cognitive load. TMJ or too much jargon. So it is okay to use technical terms, but consider your audience. Do they know those terms? Does someone just starting in the position that just looks at your report know those terms? If most people do, maybe it's okay, but maybe you need to link to something else that explains those terms. But as soon as they leave your report, you've messed with their cognitive load. So now, whatever numbers they were looking at, they have to stop and go over here and look up the terms that you've used, and then come back to your report, try to get back in the mindset of what they were thinking when they first started reading your report. So why not just spell it out? And I know it gets hard, sometimes you don't have enough room, but I would say try to make more room. Maybe it means you take a chart off the page or you simplify something. The Tableau community is really good about putting text on their reports. And if you came from kind of the SSRS world before Power BI came out, we didn't get there as much. It is okay to put a text box and explain what something is, especially if it's not completely obvious. Super intense colors everywhere are not a good thing, because when you look at this, you're looking at each individual word and paying attention to the color instead of worrying about the meaning of it. It took you longer to read what I was saying there. And then redundant information. So in this case, redundant and repeated didn't need to be there, but this could be if you made a chart that had both grid lines and axis labels and data labels, you may not need both. You might just need data labels. This could be you have multiple charts that show the same data points, and you could just use Power BI's interactivity to make that relate to some other chart. So can you take some stuff off of the page? And then whoever mentioned our inconsistent fonts earlier, inconsistent design across report pages is a problem. When we learn something and we kind of pack it away, and I think they call it a schema. So you learn something, and there's a concept called affordances. Affordances tell us how something is used based on the design. So there's a really great video, I think Vox put it out, but it's all about doors. If you ever read The Design of Everyday Things, they talk about false affordances. How many of you have gotten to a door and it's got the handle and it turns out it's a push instead of a pull? The design of that door was telling you that it should be pulled, but that's not really what it was. So it's a false or anti-affordance. What we want to do is try to design things so they're really obvious in how we interact with them. It's not entirely possible 100% of the time. So make it really obvious or put supplemental information there to get the point across. But every time you change something, we interpret it as having meaning, and we go try to learn it. We're like, I don't know this yet. I need to go relearn it. Every time you have a slicer bank that has the same slicers in it as the previous page, but it looks different. Now it's on the right side and it's blue, when earlier it was on the left and it's gray. It's not the same to our brains. We have to go reinterpret it and go, okay, oh, it's on the right side now I have to do this. We don't think of it as, oh, I got this, it looks exactly the same. We've placed more burden on us, more cognitive load, to go and relearn the attributes in our report. So for pre-attentive attributes, I'm not saying don't use bright colors, but don't use bright colors on information that doesn't require attention. So if something is bright red, that means, oh, hey, there's something, you need to do something, take some action, make a decision over here. But my bright red text isn't asking you to do anything, it's on the wrong part. This is where the multiple colors without purpose comes in. We notice those differences in colors, and then we get really distracted thinking about, well, why are those colors different? It must have some kind of meaning, but then it doesn't. We just got really happy with our color palette. Those rotated axis labels, again, it's all about, can I minimize distractions? The bar charts that don't start at 0, I'm judging length because length is a pre-attentive attribute. So when I make my axes the same, whoever said that earlier, so that I can be able to look across charts, when I start my bar charts at 0, that allows me to pre-attentively judge length instead of having to look at it and then realize, oh, the axis is truncated, and then go look at it some more and try to interpret it. I can no longer really use the difference in length of bars to tell me what I'm looking for. And then misaligned visuals on the page are kind of the same thing. It's out of whack, it's distracting. We're trying to interpret some kind of meaning around the difference, why they're not aligned. And our dark titles or backgrounds. Again, we stare at that first. Those first few seconds, we're all really distracted. We got a lot going on. Those are precious seconds. So I'm going to try to direct you through my purposeful structuring of information to the first important point and the second. So if I'm doing those really dark titles, our eyes dart to where those big, intense things are, and they don't follow the flow that we've set up in our layout. Same thing for dark, intense borders. It's taking focus away from what I'm trying to tell you, and it's not giving me any extra information. So now we get to Gestalt principles. Poorly ordered bars in a chart. Power BI does this pretty well. They'll try to order your data descending by value, but sometimes that's not what you want, or sometimes you switch what measures or axes are in there, and you need to go readjust it. We want to be able to skim down and find a trend, to be able to compare. So if we go alphabetically, that's not always the best thing. But if we're going chronologically, that order makes sense. So it's not to say there is a single right order, just that that order should make logical sense to your users, and you should make sure that you have set it. Uneven spacing, somebody else said this earlier, when two things are really close together and you're like, oh, those must be related, and then it turns out they're not. Uneven spacing between charts usually indicates groupings, and when things are closer together, we think they are alike. When things are further apart, they must not be as related. So if you just put things on the page, you're kind of taking your chances there that somebody misinterprets what you're telling them. Again, and you'll see some of these come up in all three categories, using multiple colors without purpose causes things to be not simple and orderly and regular. On the flip side, maybe we only used 3 or 4 colors, but we reused them in a way that didn't make sense. Have you ever had a chart with maybe 4 or 5 bars, but you accidentally reused a color in there? So you had purposefully changed the colors on bars because they relate to some other chart. And then the 5th bar is the same color of blue as the 1st bar. Then your users sit there and go, why are those two the same color? That must mean something, but it's really, I forgot to change the color. And then background colors that stand out more than our chart elements. So we don't need a border and a background color and white space. I'm trying to make the important things stand out, and your background color probably isn't the most important thing. So I'm going to add one more concept to the end of this, but it's really about bringing all of those things together. And it's called the squint test. And they actually use the squint test in web design. The squint test basically means you step back and look at your report, or you use a nice web tool. There are some add-ins for Chrome. I use Chrome, so there are some add-ins for Chrome that will actually blur your page for you. So it's basically abstract away a little of the detail and see what sticks out. So when you do the squint test, you want to make sure that foreground elements are standing out from the background. If the background is way more intense than the bars in the bar chart, that's probably a bad thing. Again, background or border elements, if we put them on there, this is where I said I'm not anti-borders all of the time around my charts, but I am anti-borders that draw more attention than the rest of the chart. And then I want to make sure, and this is really where the squint test started, of I want to make sure that when I step back and squint at my report, the thing that stands out the most is the most important thing on the page. If it's not, I may need to readjust my color or my layout or my spatial positioning to make sure that's happening. It's usually a color thing. Color is the most powerful and most misused design tool we have. And then finally, again, are the charts not in the right order? So when I flow, does it not feel right even at an abstracted level? So we try to define a 1 to 2 sentence message and then explain how each chart on the page works. So if I'm just skimming through, can I get that summary? Or are my charts not in the right order? Am I telling the end of the story before the beginning, like we saw on my utilization bad dashboard? And then are elements not spaced appropriately? You'll definitely catch this in a squint test. You'll go, oh, that one needs to be moved over just a little bit so that no one gets distracted by the spacing or no one thinks these two are more related than the other two charts. So you can actually get a slightly better organized list here from my website, and the URL is in the slide, so if you download those, you can have it, or just go to datasavvy.me and search for this. I made a Power BI usability checklist. And so this list gives you a place to start. It doesn't cover everything, and these are not hard and fast, always rules. But if you're new to data viz, or you feel like you have a team of people and you want to have a little bit of quality control there, try this checklist. And I've ordered it by the type of visual that we're using in Power BI. So for all visuals, do our charts have descriptive titles that explain the chart contents? Are axis labels horizontal and not diagonal? So there are things specific to bar charts that we've already talked about. So here's our, if we have a single measure in a bar chart, do we really need to change colors on every single bar? Pie charts contain no more than 3 slices. So whereas I was kind of telling you, you might need a data viz makeover if this is the good checklist. You want to check all of these off. So the list ends with the overall review, which is just the squint test that we just talked about. And then if you would like more information on the data viz usability concepts that we talked about today, I've got this little extra tab that explains what cognitive load is and a link for more information about it. And so I've got cognitive load, pre-attentive attributes, Gestalt principles. I threw some color contrast in here, but that also falls into Gestalt and pre-attentive attributes and cognitive load. And affordances like we talked about earlier, and being on message. So try this checklist out. And if you like it or have something to add to it, you can contact me on my datasavvy.me site and let me know. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought. Most of the things we talked about today are because we tend to design for ourselves instead of our intended audience. So if you design with an end user focused methodology, your data viz will be much better. You'll avoid a lot of the blunders we did today. Those not your goal things we talked about at the beginning of making shiny things, that's about us as the data viz developer kind of showing off. Look what I can do, look what I found. When what we're really trying to do is identify our intended audience and make what they need. Sometimes it's not as fun that way, but it's way more effective. So, by the way, if you guys know Kendra Little, she drew this. I super appreciate her for it because it's very accurate sometimes. We can make the best thing and we get really frustrated because we built for us. Sometimes we need to go talk to our end users a little more and find out what they want and how they work so that we can make better data viz for them. So better data viz sometimes shows a little more restraint than we see in demos. And that's perfectly okay because it's more effective. But it doesn't mean it has to be gray and boring all the time. It just means we focus attention where it needs to go and that we're actually answering the questions people care about, but we're still using, color and form and layout to do it and it doesn't have to be boring, but to me it's much more exciting when I can give people what they need out of the information I'm trying to show. I'm communicating my intended message, going back to our press conference. I'm telling people in a really efficient manner so that they don't misunderstand as I ramble, as opposed to just getting up there and winging it. So that is all of my content. Anybody have final questions, comments? Yes? Say that again? Anything in particular for the mobile platform. So there is a little bit of trickiness in management, let's call it, for the mobile platform, because any report that you publish to powerbi.com automatically becomes available to mobile app users. But it doesn't mean that it works great for mobile users. So I tend to if you guys don't know, there's actually a mobile layout for Power BI reports. So you make your nice report that people view on a laptop or tablet, and then you can click mobile layout, and all the visuals that you made become available, and you can move them kind of on a grid. They've expanded it so that you can scroll a little more now in your mobile reports, but my general rule is I don't want to scroll more than about 2 pages worth. And once I deploy, I test. If I'm going to not do the mobile view and just leave the report as is, definitely load it on your phone and see if people can click it. We get really fancy with our reports, and sometimes we have to layer things on top of each other. And so I have to go and test and make sure, can I actually click on what I was trying to click on as I interact with it there, instead of just letting the default be. Very good point, thank you.